Welcome to Waging War, the podcast where we discuss the battle between truth and lies. We believe that if you know the truth will set you free.
And welcome back to this podcast through our new clinic, Waging War. I am sitting again with my dear friend, Dr. Jim Cofield, who is a clinical psychologist and pastor at Christ Covenant here in Farragut, Tennessee. He was also the counseling director at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando. And we're sitting here, we're talking about the complexity of human nature, the complexity of God, theology, psychology, addiction, recovery, culture. And so
people a whole lot smarter than us have tried to talk about these things and not done very well. And so we probably won't shatter the earth or anything, but we want to stumble toward courageously talking about things that matter.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it.
With the idea that we don't consider ourselves, big experts on all this. Just these are conversations that probably matter.
Yeah, it is. It's conversations that matter. Absolutely. And we're still, I know I'm still learning a lot in regards to these conversations. This is, and I said in our previous podcast, these are conversations we're already having, off camera. And then these are conversations we're having between staff members at Renew that we have. And so it's just, we want to invite others into our conversations. And that's basically what this is.
So what's the conversation today, Sarah?
Okay, so the conversation today, let me read it. The allure of mysticism in a postmodern world. So we were just talking about 3 different ways of viewing the natural world, would you say? Or how would you?
Well, first of all, societies through just from the beginning of time have acknowledged that there's something that seems to be true about the fact that there's a spiritual nature to creation and to describe that. And you've got 3 basic approaches to spirituality. And these are big umbrellas, so don't, the first would be a naturalistic worldview, which would basically would be a very skeptical view of spirituality. Well, nothing's really spiritual. I
only believe in science.
Yeah, there's nothing spiritual. We're just, it doesn't do any good for us to think about that spiritual side of us, if there is such a thing. There are kind of naturalistic worldview positions that at least maybe tip a hat and say, well, maybe some of that's out there, but that's not for us to understand. And then there's a kind of an aggressive naturalistic worldview that says, this ridiculous. We're just animals, kind of with a pretty high form of animal. And it doesn't, and there isn't and they'll even describe religion or spirituality as ways to cope with the fact that we are just merely
opium of the masses,
we're just,
or for the masses.
So that's the naturalistic worldview, often found in academia. It's often found
Darwinian worldview, evolutionary.
Yeah, the idea that's interesting. Well, anyway, I was going to say Darwin actually believed, at least initially in his theory, that this is how God did things, as opposed to there is no God in it. That kind of came later. But all that to say, the naturalistic worldview is one view.
Okay.
And if you can imagine a continuum, that's on one view. Spirituality either is nothing or it's not helpful to understand it or try to, because we can't ever get anything from it. The other extreme would be transcendentalism, which would basically say everything is spiritual. The tree, the spirit of the tree, the spirit of the wind, and a lot of what's often called mysticism in our world. Sometimes people call New Age. It's not new at all. It's been around a long time, and it's an idea that kind of everything is spiritual. We're all everybody's right, and we're all, spiritual beings, and everything is spiritual. Like I said, inanimate objects are spiritual, and so that's a kind of a transcendental worldview. So there's kind of a naturalistic worldview, nothing is really spiritual. A transcendental worldview that says everything's spiritual. The third way to see the world would be a theistic worldview, which would say there is a God, and that God determines what is spiritual or important and what isn't, and is the one that kind of declares reality around that. And it was interesting, when C.S. Lewis spoke about these sort of things, he said that he thought that the transcendental worldview was the easiest and the most pleasant, because it's kind of like what he'd like to believe. It doesn't fit reality, because everybody's good in a kind of transcendental worldview, and everything is. We at the Renew Clinic, coming from a kind of a Christian perspective, we don't think everybody over here is stupid or everybody over here is stupid, but we think the best way to understand the world is through a theistic worldview, an idea that we are spiritual beings. Every moment has a possibility of sacredness to it, and that there is a true spirituality in humanity, and that there's more than just, how did Einstein say it? There's not everything important is measurable, not everything measurable is important. There's a way in which there's more to life in this world than what can be, measured and put in a test tube. There is a spirituality that almost every culture has held on to. So that would be a theistic worldview. Within a theistic worldview, you've got different understandings of that, of kind of God. Islamic worldview is a theistic worldview. Judaism is a theistic worldview, with a little different understanding of God than a Muslim or an Islamic understanding of God. A Christian worldview, what makes those all similar, and there's a few others that would fall under a theistic worldview. What makes that similar is the fact that they all speak of God, that there's something that is making things spiritual, and that kind of controls it, as opposed to transcendental
truth.
As opposed to a transcendental worldview where kind of we all can be gods at some level, and everybody's. So that would be those would be the three ways that people typically, and that's a little oversimplified, but the three ways typically you could put most philosophical understandings of life into one of those three categories.
So the theistic worldview, God, when pertaining to truth, God is the giver of truth. In a transcendental worldview, we can just create our own truth. We're all little gods kind of creating our own realities. And then what was the first naturalistic worldview is more of an atheistic.
Well, it would say empiricism, or study, experimentation, the scientific method, that's what produces truth. Or sometimes you can have people in that naturalist world would say rationalism produces truth. So my thinking or my experimentation produces truth. And it's not that can't produce some things that are true. I mean, I'm sure not anti-science. I want the medical doctor that does open heart surgery on me to be pretty, know a whole lot about science. It's just that the idea being, is there more to life than just that? But the naturalistic worldview would say truth comes from rationalism, thinking, logic, or from empiricism, which would be that scientific method of experimentation and observation. The transcendental worldview would say truth comes from experience. Since we're all
from the inside,
we're all, and so a lot of Disney movies that, I just need to,
Yeah.
know myself and,
Let it go.
and so there is a way in which they make for nice entertainment, but it ultimately has a somewhat of a mystical worldview that reality is kind of something that is fluid and being created by the people in it.
Follow your heart,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
And so in that third position, the theistic worldview would say no. Truth is determined by the deity you worship, or the
truth
deity
giver.
that runs the world. And not to say, I mean, I think I would be a theistic worldview person, but I really respect empiricism and rationalization. I really respect people's emotions, but I don't think that's the last word on truth.
Because if you think about it, I mean, even rational thinking and coming it is still from within. I mean, it's still depending on both transcendental and the natural worldviews. Are a lot of times it's from my own observation, my own rational thinking, and so what makes most sense to me as far as what's consistent with just how I see the world working, and is that truth is actually something that there is a greater truth that we are navigating and exploring and living inside of, but I just find it very isolating, that thought that, truth, that I can create my own truth. I just find that very isolating. But going back to the theocratic worldview, you had named 3 different religions: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, that kind of they all fall under that camp. And that is where we fall, especially at Renew Clinic. So what are the 3 differences? Because a lot of times people think they're all kind of the same. They worship the same God. They, they just, or they're all kind of, all 3 the same. But what would you say the differences are between the 3?
Well, and first I would say, I just want to remind people that Renew Clinic will treat anybody, whatever they believe.
Absolutely, yeah.
But you'll be treated from a perspective that is clinically informed, but that believes that there is a God, that and there is a spiritual side of your recovery and of life that is part of what it means to be healthy and to flourish, and not just to survive. The most simple way, and I'm not a world religion expert, and I don't mean to by any means. This is kind of like Barney the dinosaur goes to seminary. I'm not trying to say there's great wisdom here, but a very simplistic understanding of how those different faiths see God. Most of the theistic Judaism, Islam, both how they're similar is they both see man's task is to do something to appease or to win God's favor. That God is either angry and needs to be appeased, or God is is looking for man to move up to a certain level to get his blessing or his favor. Christianity does have a different sense of what is taking place, though ironically, a lot of Christians don't live this. They kind of turn Christianity into I've got to try harder and be a better man or a better woman, which often ends up being just legalism, which looks a lot more like those other religions and what I think the gospel would be in the Bible. But
right.
A Christian worldview, a theistic worldview that's Christian, would say that man can't bridge that gap between God and man. That whatever goodness I can muster out out of this very broken man that I am isn't enough. And so Christian view would be not that man must strive to reach God, but that God has chosen to reach and cover that gap himself. So through the work of Christ, the idea that man can be redeemed and therefore back in relationship with God. And so so spirituality is not me trying harder, because that doesn't work very long. The idea that spirituality from a Christian perspective is understanding that God has closed that, if you will, that gap between us and Him, and so different worldviews, naturalistic, transcendental, theistic, and within a theistic worldview, you do have a different understanding of the nature of the relationship between man and God. And Christianity is somewhat unique in the way that it understands how that relationship with God and man exists. But out of the three broad ways of seeing the world, naturalistic, transcendental, and theistic, two of them at least acknowledge there's a spiritual realm. And what's really popular is because, and quite frankly, some of it's because Christians didn't do a very good job talking about this when they had an opportunity to. And there's been so often, there's been a lot of hypocrisy. And a lot of people have used their Christianity to hate people or to be angry people. And because of that, the world, most people have a sense there's something spiritual, and so they tend to be drawn lately into kind of a more mysticism way of, and so,
because we crave a spiritual experience.
Yeah, we want a spiritual experience. That's why some people do drugs. That's not why the addict ultimately ends up staying with drugs, but, I want to experience, being out of my body. I want to experience the colors more deeply or whatever. There's something inside of us that I would say comes from the fact that you're created by God in His image, but that craves the unseen world. And so people try to kind of get a touch of that or a taste of that through kind of experiential, spiritual things, often real vague, that's fairly popular today. Kind of a very.
It is, with like crystals and tarot readings and like the chakras, and when I think of mysticism, that's kind of the thing that I think about.
Yeah, all those would fall under kind of that sort of New Age mysticism, and that stuff's been around a long, long time.
So what's the danger of it?
Well, the danger is you're getting an experience without the reality of, so you're dabbling in what is true. There is a spiritual world. So your experience might be accurate, but your theology's not. Meaning, and it's spirituality for the sake of spirituality as opposed to spirituality because that's who you were made to be. And so it kind of, the danger is you can get lost in especially if you're defining all the parameters of what is true and what isn't, what's spiritual and what isn't, and you can get really lost there.
Well, I was thinking too, Satan presents himself as an angel of light. So these things can appear good for a time, but how do we know what spirit we're being led by if it's not informed by truth, if it's not informed by theology, if it's not informed by God's word? We don't know really what we're being led by because, as Christians, we don't believe that all, the spiritual realm is just some esoteric place where, things flutter around and they're just kind of neutral. We believe in good and evil. And there are things that are good. We have angels, God has angels. We have, the Holy Spirit. We have, that. And then there's also evil. There are demons. The Bible clearly talks about it. There are evil impure spirits that, and Satan says I just said it, but he walks around as an angel of light, so he presents not with horns and a pitchfork. He presents to seduce us. And he knows exactly how to seduce each of us, And for many of us, we're craving a spiritual experience, especially if we're not connected to God, which is the one we're supposed to be connected to, and getting that spiritual food from him, we're going to look for it in other things. And so because that need's not being met in Christ for a lot of people, he'll seduce us into a spiritual experience that will ultimately could lead to a lot of bad things. I would think that would be a danger as well, is, like you said, it's not informed by theology.
Well, I'm kind of a big fan of C.S. Lewis, and he wrote a fascinating book called Screwtape Letters, which was he had quite a mind. And in the introduction to that book, and I'm going to butcher the quote, so I'm not quoting it, I'm just going to give the essence of what he says. But in the introduction to that book, he says, there are two equally dangerous tendencies people have when it comes to the devil, and I'll just add in spiritual things. One is to think they don't exist at all, and therefore you're deceived and you don't even know it. And the other is to take an unhealthy interest in a kind of that dark side of that evil side of spirituality, because then you get lost in that.
Yeah.
And just I don't want to be, it's not just the Christian world. It's not just this simplistic, fundamentalist Christians who believe in good and bad, even Carl Jung years ago talked about the archetypes in the world. Most great novels have this tension between evil and good. Even just, my goodness, a Star Wars saga, there's the dark side and the light side. There's been a universal understanding for most of our history as humans of some things that seem to be innately wired in our world of good and evil and happy and sad and male and female. There seems to be a deep archetypes, if you will, that seem to be very deeply wired in our world. And so this idea, it's to the postmodern naturalistic worldview to kind of have a conversation about that you mention the devil or that you mention evil or you mention, it's like,
I know.
oh, there's the flat earth society there. But quite frankly, that thought that there's evil has been around a lot longer than the
postmodern thought.
than the thought,
Right.
that we have that seems to be prevalent today. And if there is not good and there's not evil, then on what basis was Hitler bad?
Exactly.
And if there's not something that's true,
how can we know anything?
And so it sounds very sophisticated to talk about the fact that and kind of put down a more traditional understanding of reality, but it's pretty. They can be pretty dangerous to say, I'm going to live my life based on the assumption there is nothing spiritual, and that seems to be you're going against a long history of humanity's understanding of life.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really good. I think this is a good place to stop. And I think the reason why, too, that we have this conversation is because in recovery, it's so important to know truth, Christ. And I think if I have to sing that tune until the day he takes me home, it is so important for all of us to be restored is to know the truth.
Well, and mysticism, you see in the recovery movement that, I mean, even everybody in the naturalistic worldview has to at least acknowledge that the most successful addiction programs have been programs that acknowledge the spiritual world. Whether that's AA or... The problem with a lot of them is they have such a vague, mystical understanding of the spiritual world that it's not something solid to hold on to. Though even not having something solid to hold on to, just at least acknowledging that we're spiritual beings, many people get better in that environment because there's a sense that they've acknowledged their the fact that they're not merely flesh and blood, that there's something spiritual about who they are. But I think that what's unique about Renew Clinic and is not just Renew Clinic, but a Christian theistic worldview of recovery is that you are a spiritual being made in the image of God, and you don't have to live in an escape from reality position. You can face reality because of a God who has reached down to you to connect you with Him. And that's kind of good news.
It's awesome news. And that's only found in Christ. Thank you so much for this conversation.
This has been Waging War. Thanks for fighting alongside us this week.